Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Truth About Psychiatry. This is the 14th episode, I believe. I should have checked that before I started, but I believe we are number 14. And let me just check real quick. See how many we've done thus far. Yes. Oh, we've actually done 14. So this is episode 15. So last episode was on the therapeutic state. And in this episode 15, I would like to talk about the truth of psychiatry, or the truth about psychiatry in connection um, with what Thomas Szasz calls the theology of medicine. So I would give the title to this episode, The Theology of Medicine. So I want to look at a few of Thomas Szasz's books that we haven't talked too much about. The first one is Coercion as Cure, A Critical History of Psychiatry. The second is The Theology of Medicine. And the third, and one of my favorites, is The Manufacture of Madness, a comparative study of the Inquisition and the mental health movement. So these are the three books that I would like to discuss today. And we'll just start with this, Coercion as Cure, A Critical History of Psychiatry. This is a great book that is a great, if you're looking for an introduction to the history of psychiatry, this might be a good one. I also recommend Thomas Szasz, his book, Psychiatry, the Science of Lies. Also anything written by Robert Whitaker has a good history of psychiatry, Mad in America, Anatomy of an Epidemic, and Psychiatry Under the Influence. Peter Bregan's Toxic Psychiatry has a good history of psychiatry. And Bonnie Burstow, Psychiatry Interrogated, or no, Psychiatry in the Business of Madness is probably the best history of psychiatry by Bonnie Burstow. For a history of the drugs, I also recommend Joanna Moncrief's The Bitterest Pills. But this book by Thomas Szasz, Coercion as Cure, will help us to understand why psychiatry isn't just a pseudoscience, or what I like to call a pseudoscientific system of slavery that masquerades as a medical profession, but it is also its own sort of religion. And this will tie into Szasz's book, The Theology of Medicine. And finally, when we talk about the manufacture of madness and the comparison that Szasz makes with the Inquisition, we'll see how that theology of medicine, or the pseudo-religion of psychiatry, has created a modern Inquisition comparable to the historical Inquisition, in which witches were hunted down and executed. So that's a little bit of the framework of what we'll talk about in this episode. I'll also highlight a little something from a woman that I met. I mentioned her before, Ann Blake-Tracy. She also is the executive director of the International Coalition for Drug Awareness, and she has some interesting insights in her book Prozac, Panacea, or Pandora about the connections to why psychiatry is troublesome in a religious sense. So, Coercion as Cure. Thomas Szasz is unquestionably the most prolific and outspoken critic of coercive psychiatry. In addition to Psychiatry, the Science of Lies, and Anti-Psychiatry Quackery Squared, one of the last books that Szasz wrote was Coercion as Cure, A Critical History of Psychiatry. That's interesting. I didn't remember that Coercion as Cure was one of the last books that Szasz wrote. So there's another good reason to read this book, is because it will contain all of Szasz's, probably the best that he's written, his accumulation of wisdom over the years, of knowledge and wisdom on this topic, could probably be found in this book, since it's one of the last books that he wrote. All of Szasz's books are meritorious, but Coercion as Cure is uniquely praiseworthy because of its concise and accurate depiction of the underlying motive and the moving force of psychiatry, coercion. In Coercion as Cure, Szasz demonstrates with dexterity how psychiatry is distinguished from the healing arts by its direct opposition to the established mantra of medicine, primum non nocere, first do no harm. His thesis is simple and true, although most historians of psychiatry write apologetically, hagiographically, and panegyrically. Szasz writes truthfully. Quote, contrary to Arieti's and Kraepelin's assertions, it is easy to define psychiatry. The problem is that defining it truthfully, acknowledging its self-evident ends and the means used to achieve them, is socially unacceptable and professionally suicidal. Psychiatric tradition, social expectation, and the law, both criminal and civil, identify coercion as a profession's determining characteristic. And I agree with Szasz. There's not anything remotely scientific or medical or consensual, although Szasz tries to distinguish between consensual psychiatry and non-consensual psychiatry, which I think is a mistake, because even Szasz himself admits that psychiatry, the whole enterprise, is based on coercion. Psychiatry, Szasz rightly argues, is, quote, the theory and practice of coercion, rationalized as a diagnosis of mental illness and justified as medical treatment aimed at protecting the patient from himself and society from the patient. That's an important point. The theory and practice of coercion. Psychiatry is the theory and practice of coercion, rationalized as the diagnosis of mental illness and justified as medical treatment aimed at protecting the patient from himself and society from the patient. That's just spot on. Szasz sees in psychiatry the rudiments of a false religion, one in which force and fraud combine with cunning euphemisms to produce coercion as cure. So this is a problem with Szasz because he recognizes psychiatry as a false religion, but he's much too hard on good religion, and probably wasn't able to see that there's also such a thing as true religion. But at least he was able to expose this one aspect of false religion. Szasz identifies three main erroneous premises that former historians of psychiatry have embraced. One, that so-called mental diseases exist. Two, that they are diseases of the brain. And three, that the incarceration of dangerous mental patients is medically rational and morally just. To correct these errors, Szasz asserts that mental disease is fictitious disease, psychiatric diagnosis is disguised disdain, and psychiatric treatment is coercion disguised as care, typically carried out in prisons called hospitals. These are bold claims, but with characteristic acumen, Szasz bolsters his claims with incontrovertible historical evidence and scintillating literary and philosophical support. Szasz is as ardent a defender of liberty and responsibility as he is an opponent of coercion and irresponsibility. But his opponent is not just psychiatry per se. As shown in Coercion as Cure, the creation and the rise of psychiatry is couched within a post-Enlightenment secular culture that defines psychiatric coercion as a virtuous endeavor to care for and to benefit the patient. For example, Szasz decries the coercive paternalism in John Locke's second treatise on government. In his second treatise, Locke categorizes so-called madmen as persons lacking in reason who are justifiably deprived of liberty. In contrast, and in defense of the coerced against the coercer, Szasz later cites C.S. Lewis. This is a quotation that I've referenced in a previous video, but it's so great that we're going to read it again. Szasz, citing C.S. Lewis, quote, "We know that one school of psychology already regards religion as a neurosis. When this particular neurosis becomes inconvenient to government, what is to hinder government from proceeding to cure it? Such cure will of course be compulsory, but under the humanitarian theory it will not be called by the shocking name of persecution. No one will blame us for being Christians. No one will hate us. No one will revile us. The new Nero will approach us with the silky manners of a doctor. And though all will be in fact as compulsory as the Tunica Molesta or Smithfield or Tyburn, all will go on within the unemotional therapeutic sphere where words like right and wrong or freedom and slavery are never heard. And thus, when the command is given, every prominent Christian in the land may vanish overnight into institutions for the treatment of the ideologically unsound, and it will rest with the expert gaolers to say when, if ever, they are to re-emerge. But it will not be persecution. Even if the treatment is painful, even if it is lifelong, even if it is fatal, that will be only a regrettable accident. The intention was purely therapeutic. In ordinary medicine, there were painful operations and fatal operations, so in this. But because they are treatment, not punishment, they can be criticized only by fellow experts on technical grounds, never by men as men on grounds of justice." Great insight by C.S. Lewis, and we talked about that in the previous video, if you want to watch that, if you haven't seen it, on the therapeutic state. This is indeed a sound defense and a sobering warning. But if psychiatry promotes coercion as cure, how does it accomplish this terrible injustice? In the introduction to Coercion as Cure, Szasz explains, "You cannot judge a book by its cover," says the proverb, "nor can you judge what psychiatrists do by what they say they do. What psychiatrists in fact do is self-evident. They stigmatize people, deprive them of liberty, injure their bodies and minds by means of forcibly imposed physical and chemical agents and interventions, and call their actions the diagnosis and treatment of disease. They do not, of course, do this all by themselves. In the ordinary course of events, the pre-patients, to use Irving Goffman's felicitous term, are first stigmatized by their families or peers. The psychiatrist makes the unofficial stigma official by pinning a psychiatric diagnosis on the subject. The diagnosis is a double stigma, identifying the subject as both deranged and dangerous." Szasz knew intuitively, long before he began his medical training, that mental illness was a medical fiction. But he became credentialed as a psychiatrist in order to critique state-sponsored psychiatric violence and the justification and legitimization of the use of force. In the course of his critique, Szasz formulated one of his keenest insights, that psychiatry has become an ersatz religion. Quote, "The founders did not anticipate, nor could they have anticipated, that the idea of mental health and the alliance of psychiatry and the state might one day replace the idea of salvation and the alliance of church and state. In short, that the therapeutic state might supplant the theological state." The key concept throughout all of Szasz's writings is that the therapeutic state replaced the theological state, that mental health, mental illness, psychiatry, combined with the state, has supplanted faith in God, religion, and now we have a pseudoscience that has rushed in to fill the vacuum left behind by religion and pseudo-religion. And we'll talk about that in the Theology of Medicine and the Manufacture of Madness. In fact, later on in the introduction to Coercion as Cure, Szasz defines psychiatry as a pseudoscientific statist religion, the study and teaching of psychiatric fictions, authoritatively acclaimed as scientific truths, and the enforcement of social controls rationalized by pseudomedical diagnoses and defined as treatments. Nevertheless, Szasz is careful to separate Freud from Kraepelin, or psychoanalysis from psychiatry proper, because the former contains elements of contract, while the latter rests entirely on coercion. So psychoanalysis, there's some aspects of um, consent or contract, and we can even see that in so-called psychotherapy, even though, as we've talked about in another previous video, that also Szasz has written a book, The Myth of Psychotherapy. So it's all a myth of mental illness, myth of psychotherapy. But I think in a certain sense there is perhaps, and this is played out in the history of psychiatry as well, there is a sense in which psychoanalysis and psychotherapy at least introduces some consent and some contract into the practice. I'm still not as convinced maybe as Szasz, because Szasz, I believe, practiced some psychotherapy, and he had a lot of theories about it. And he was cautious about both psychiatry proper and psychotherapy. And I would just be careful of both and recognize that they're really closer together and more part of the same thing than separate things. A lot of people in the anti-psychiatry or critical of people who are critical of psychiatry like to point to the the difference between biological psychiatry and psychotherapy. But I think it's a mistake, because even as Szasz admits in other passages, the whole thing is rotten. Or as Robert Whitaker has written, there's the rotten barrel of psychiatry, and the whole thing is rotten. So sometimes, even though there's more consent and contract involved in psychotherapy, there's also the underlying coercion, because that is, as Szasz says in this book, it's inherent in the nature of psychiatry. So that was a little side note on that. So Szasz is careful to separate Freud from Kraepelin, or psychoanalysis from psychiatry proper, because the former contains elements of contract, while the latter rests entirely on coercion. But his caution ends there. Quote, "I have never harbored any patriotic sentiments toward psychiatry," Szasz writes. "My aim has been to abolish psychiatric slavery, not to reform it." So there's a very clear statement. Szasz was an abolitionist, not a reformer. Szasz is unflinching and unrelenting in his denouncement of the evils of psychiatry. Quote, "Many people recognize that psychiatrists deal with human problems, not diseases of the brain, which fall in the domain of neurologists and neurosurgeons. However, it is one thing privately to recognize a forbidden fact, another to accept its moral and social implications, and still another to proclaim publicly that the psychiatrist emperor is not merely naked, but a liar and abuser of his fellow man, unworthy of being considered a member of a healing profession." After this compelling introduction, Szasz proceeds to expose the nefarious history of psychiatry in all its horror, excoriating practices such as mental hospitalization as therapeutic imprisonment, shock and commotion as terror therapy, and moral treatment as renaming coercion. In subsequent chapters, he lambasts coercive psychiatric practices such as sleep deprivation therapy, iatrogenic epilepsy, lobotomy, or cerebral spaying, and psychopharmacology. Without doubt, other authors of the critical history of psychiatry, such as Robert Whitaker, Peter Breggin, and James Davies, are indebted to Szasz for his courage, his comprehensive scholarship, and his meticulous research. I cannot commend Thomas Szasz's Coercion as Cure more highly, but I can recommend it to anyone who has ever been puzzled by the myth of mental illness. In contrast to the coercion inherent in psychiatry, Thomas Szasz offers his insights by way of persuasion, and I recommend Szasz's book by way of invitation. So, Coercion as Cure, Critical History of Psychiatry, and perhaps we'll talk more about the history, delve more into the details of the history of psychiatry in the future. So, that leads us into a discussion of the theology of medicine. So as we've seen, psychiatry is not just a pseudoscience. It's actually a false religion. It's a kind of um, false religion that Szasz would situate in what he calls the Theology of Medicine. So, another book by Thomas Szasz. Thomas Szasz, The Theology of Medicine, contains 11 essays and Paul Kurtz's interview with Dr. Szasz. Like many of Szasz's books, the Theology of Medicine criticizes psychiatry from a political as well as a philosophical angle. While there is much to quibble with respecting his libertarianism, Szasz effectively exposes the roots of modern medical hegemony. The basic thrust of Szasz's argument is that modern medicine has become a religion. Whereas in medieval times, laymen were subject to the authority and the erudition of priests, in modern times, patients are subject to the authority and the erudition of doctors. To simplify Szasz's major thesis, the paradigm of religious authority under priests has been replaced by the paradigm of quasi-religious authority of doctors over patients. Instead of dazzling patients with Latin phrases and convoluted creeds, as did the priests of yore, doctors now dazzle their patients with abstruse medical terminology and jargon. The result is that very few people have thought to question the authority of the new state-sponsored religion of medicine. I think that pertains to medicine generally. It's not to say there are not good apples who actually teach true principles in medicine, because there are. It's just to say that I think Thomas Szasz' insight is worth considering, and there's a lot of truth to it. Excuse me. In fact, as I was reading this, I was reminded of an experience that I had once with a doctor, and we were discussing some ailment that I had, or some health struggle. I can't recall exactly what it was, but I do remember the conversation that the doctor started listing off some terms, and I started asking him about those terms. You know, what does that word mean? You know, a lot of fancy words were coming out. Some, as kind of the priests of yore would use their Latin phrases and their erudition as their, as a sign of their authority. So I was just asking, what is that? Where did that idea come from? And just basically curious to learn. And after a while, the doctor started to get annoyed, almost in a way to say, like, why are you questioning me? I'm a doctor. Like, you're the patient. You should just be accepting at face value everything I'm telling you. And I wasn't having it. And so I continued to ask him questions, because I wanted to know. And he wasn't happy with that, and even got visibly upset. And that was just an experience that sort of taught me, I don't think that he was necessarily a bad person, and probably my questioning, my Socratic nature can sometimes be annoying to people. But it just showed me that even a good doctor can be annoyed when his authority is questioned. So that was just a little personal autobiographical note in relation to Szasz's insight about the theology of medicine. So I'll repeat what I said before. Instead of dazzling peasants with Latin phrases and convoluted creeds, as did the priests of yore, doctors now dazzle their patients with abstruse medical terminology and jargon. They might even, and psychiatrists, that's another level removed of terminology and jargon, because you're going to hear all the ideas about so-called mental illness and the chemical imbalance hoax. They might even talk to you about neurotransmitters and synapses, and really start to, you know, showing brain scans and trying to back up this whole myth with this whole apparatus of um, well, what would I call it? Probably apparatus of ideologies to bolster their own perceived authority. The result is that very few people have thought to question the authority of the new state-sponsored religion of medicine. So go ahead and question it. Szasz' underlying theories of liberty are too much beholden to John Stuart Mill, but the arguments in this book are most philosophically sound when he assimilates C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man and the humanitarian theory of punishment in order to demonstrate that modern medicine, and psychiatry in particular, has become a state-sponsored religion that operates cruelly under the guise of compassion. So this is just another way in which Thomas Szasz was a great researcher and intelligent thinker, that he was that immersed in literature and that he was familiar with C.S. Lewis and one of C.S. Lewis's greatest books, and one of my favorites, The Abolition of Man. Torture becomes treatment, involuntary incarceration becomes hospitalization, and drugging becomes medication. There is so much more to be savored in Szasz's study of the state-sponsored religion of medicine and the pseudoscientific sect of this religion that is known as psychiatry. The 11 chapter titles are as follows. Chapter 1, The Moral Physician. Chapter 2, Illness and Indignity. Chapter 3, A Map for Medical Ethics, the Moral Justifications of Medical Intervention. Chapter 4, The Ethics of Addiction. Chapter 5, The Ethics of Behavior Therapy. Chapter 6, The Ethics of Suicide. Chapter 7, Language and Lunacy. Chapter 8, The Right to Health. Chapter 9, Justice in the Therapeutic State. Chapter 10, Illogic and Immorality of Involuntary Psychiatric Interventions. A Personal Restatement. Chapter 11, The Metaphors of Faith and Folly. And then here are a few tantalizing excerpts from Thomas Szasz, The Theology of Medicine. Quote, in the age of faith, men and women had to and wanted to call their spiritual problems sins, and their spiritual authorities fathers, who in turn called them children. In the age of medicine, men and women have to and want to call their spiritual problems sicknesses, and their spiritual authorities doctors, who in turn call them patients. Another, in short, although love appeals to the ideal of consideration for the need of others, and justice appeals to the ideal of consideration for agreed upon rules, in actual practice, just actions afford more protection for the self-defined interests of others than do loving actions. That is a really keen insight, in my opinion, especially in this day and age where love and compassion are all the rage, but they're completely severed from any notion of truth or justice. So it actually, as many authors, Dostoevsky, trying to think of the Catholic, the female writer, Flannery O'Connor has pointed out, and C.S. Lewis also, when mercy becomes completely severed from justice, or I think it's Flannery O'Connor says, when Christ is taken out of the picture, then compassion and mercy actually become tyrannical. I think C.S. Lewis has a statement on how you actually have to, for mercy to be merciful, it has to grow in the crags of justice. So this is a really insightful comment by Szasz, that just actions afford more protection for the self-defined interests of others than do loving actions. Um, so, also, Elder Oaks, President Oaks, who's a apostle and leader in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He's written about truth and tolerance being two sides of the same coin. So I think that Thomas Szasz was quite alert to that truth. Another passage. The struggle for human liberty and dignity is now being waged on many fronts and in many different ways. As humanists, as linguistic humanists, if I may suggest a tentative self-description, some of us might find fitting, we would and should be on the vanguard of those whose weapons are pens, not swords, typewriters and books, not demonstrations and bombs. That means that we must defend human rights because the victims are human beings. If you find that assertion contrived or opaque, may I remind you that it's currently popular for humanists and civil libertarians to champion the rights of the mentally ill and the rights of other victimized groups such as homosexuals, drug addicts, blacks, women, and so forth. From the point of view I am trying to articulate, all that is a grave mistake. We should reject slogans such as protecting the rights of the mentally ill. We should, and of other victimized groups. Instead, we should protect the rights of people to reject being called or categorized as mentally ill or anything else against their will, except as part of the process of the administration of the criminal law. In other words, we should stand steadfast for the right of men and women to reject those involuntary identifications or diagnoses that have traditionally justified and made possible, and often continue to justify and make possible, their inferior or subhuman treatment at the hands of those who ostensibly care for them, but who actually scapegoat them. This is also a very keen insight by Thomas Szasz, in my opinion, because especially now, since Szasz's death, not too long ago, we've seen the rise in so-called identity politics. And what Szasz is saying, I think, would be a way of rejecting that and saying, instead of the rights of the mentally ill or the rights of homosexuals, drug addicts, blacks, women, what Szasz is saying, I think, would support the rejection of identity politics, which I think is right, and I think a lot of the battle in maybe the spiritual battle in our world nowadays, at least one facet of it is the battle over identity. In my personal faith, my personal opinion, or my belief is that our true identity, the reason why there's such a battle raging around it is because it's so it's so important to understand who we truly are. In my belief, we are children of God. We're literal offspring of God, created in His image. And as spirit children of God, that is our true identity. Also believe that God created man in His own likeness and image, male and female, and that gender, there's a proclamation to the world on the family that the Church of Jesus Christ issued in 1995, that gender is an essential characteristic of individual premortal, mortal, and eternal identity and purpose. So who we truly are, that is my belief of who we truly are as sons and daughters of God. But even in other faith traditions, who people believe in human beings as created in the image of God, and even in the Western philosophical tradition, there's an understanding of human beings as dignified moral agents with the freedom and capacity to choose, and other faith traditions have a very noble view of who human beings are. And I think we can see, and I think Thomas Szasz also saw that that noble and true identity is under attack. And he saw how psychiatry was part of that attack. And he also wrote eloquently on resisting that. Here's another passage. I propose a medical reformation analogous to the Protestant Reformation, specifically a protest against the systematic mystification of man's relationship to his body and his professionalized separation from it. The immediate aim of this reform would be to remove the physician as intermediary between man and his body, and to give the layman direct access to the language and contents of the pharmacopoeia. It is significant that until recently, physicians wrote prescriptions in Latin, and that medical diagnoses and treatments were still couched in a jargon whose chief aim was to awe and mystify the laity. Were man to have unencumbered access to his own body and the means of chemically altering it, it would spell the end of medicine, or at least as we know it. This is why, with faith in scientific medicine so strong, there is little interest in this kind of medical reform. Physicians fear the loss of their privileges, laymen the loss of their protections. This is great. Thomas Szasz saw himself as a kind of reformer of medicine because, as he's talking about the theology of medicine, this medical religion, he saw himself as initiating a sort of reformation. And I think he's right about that. And maybe since he writes critically of the medical jargon and the attempt of doctors to mystify the laity, meaning, with Latinisms and previously with Latin phrases and their erudition, I was thinking that one of the things that helped the Reformation was to have the Bible translated into English and translated into languages that the people could read. So instead of the Bible just being in Latin or Greek, the translations gave access, and Tyndale was one of the martyrs for the cause, who heroically translated the Bible. And I'm trying to remember the exact phrase, but he said something great. He was arguing, I believe, with, you'll have to look up the actual story, but I'll paraphrase. A priest or some clergyman was telling him, we can't translate. We have to keep the Bible in its original language. And Tyndale said that basically he will make sure that the boy who drives the plow will know more about the scriptures than you do. So I think what Thomas Szasz might have been doing is kind of bringing medicine down to earth and saying, I'm going to make the common man know more about his own body and his own health, and even what medicine means in terms of his own health. He wanted to bring that, translate it, so put the power back into the hands of the common man, as he says, removing the physician as the intermediary between man and his body. So that could be a sort of reformation, but I do think that he was also intending a revolution in the sense of abolishing psychiatry. To be sure, people do suffer, and that fact, according to doctors and patients, lawyers and laymen, is now enough to justify calling and considering them patients. As in an earlier age through the universality of sin, now through the universality of suffering, men, women, and children become, whether they like it or not, whether they want to or not, the patient penitents of their physician priests. And over both patient and doctor now stands the Church of Medicine, its theology defining their roles and the rules of the games they must play, and its canon laws, now called public health and mental health laws, enforcing conformity to the dominant medical ethic. I think that's another keen insight. The problem we touch on here is really as old as mankind. It goes to the very roots of freedom and responsibility and humanism, to the roots of the question of what is man. It's all contained in the parable of the fall. Who was the first pusher? The serpent. Who were the first addicts? Eve and Adam. And what was the consequence of that original addiction? Freedom. It's all there in the first few pages of the Old Testament. But who reads that nowadays? And who reads it with open eyes or with an open mind? And then I say, perhaps it's time for us to open our eyes. Perhaps it's time to wake up. So that's an interesting. I mean, Szasz, he was very critical of religion, but in a certain way that there are certain passages where you can see that he was somewhat friendly to at least Christianity and religion when he perceived it to be fostering both liberty and responsibility. So that's an introduction to Thomas Szasz, the Theology of Medicine. Coercion is Cure, we just did. Theology of Medicine. And now, one of my favorite books by Thomas Szasz ties into this is The Manufacture of Madness. So this book is a comparative study of the Inquisition and the mental health movement. And there's a lot of passages I want to share from this book because, we talked about in a previous video the psychiatric slavery and liberation by oppression, the comparative study of slavery and psychiatry. This is a comparative study of the Inquisition and psychiatry. So, I'll just dive right in. How is it that every time I read a book by Thomas Szasz, he surprises me with some interesting, intriguing new insight? Szasz's book, The Manufacture of Madness, a comparative study of the Inquisition and the mental health movement, is replete with keen insights and remarkably clear descriptions of the true nature of psychiatry. In this book, Szasz examines the similarities between the Inquisition and institutional psychiatry. Quote, in an earlier work, The Myth of Mental Illness, Szasz writes in his preface to the original edition, I tried to show how and why the concept of mental illness is erroneous and misleading. In the present work, I shall try to show how and why the ethical convictions and social arrangements based on this concept constitute an immoral ideology of intolerance. In particular, I shall compare the belief in witchcraft and the persecution of witches with the belief in mental illness and the persecution of mental patients. Although I disagree with Szasz about many of his evaluations of religion, politics, and history, his analogy is appropriate because it exposes the absurdity and the immorality inherent in the modern mental health craze. The basic premise of this book is that false religious ideologies, namely the superstitions that fueled the Inquisition, never really disappeared. They were simply transformed into false scientific and medical ideologies. In sum, medicine replaced theology. By the same token, the alienists replaced the inquisitor, and the insane replaced witches. The result, Szasz argues, was the substitution of a medical mass movement for a religious one, the persecution of mental patients replacing the persecution of heretics. Setting aside arguments about the reality or illusion of witchcraft, it is clear that during the Inquisition, men fabricated myths about witches in order to hunt them down and persecute them. As disturbing as this is, I couldn't help but think of the brilliant scene in the Monty Python and the Holy Grail in which a group of frenzied peasants arraigns a supposed witch before the wise Sir Bedivere. So whoever has seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail will understand what I'm talking about, and if you haven't seen it, that's a very unfortunate gap in your education that should be remedied as soon as possible. Sir Bedivere's first question to the group of peasants is, how do you know she's a witch? Building on Szasz's analogy, or a similar question might be posed to groups of frenzied mental health advocates when they arraign a victim before a psychiatrist. How do you know she or he is mentally ill? One of the peasants pipes up, she looks like one. She looks like a witch. When the supposed witch is brought forward, she insists that she is innocent and that she is not a witch. Sir Bedivere wonders why she is dressed like a witch, and the supposed witch responds that the rabble-rousers dressed her up as one. They dressed her up as a witch and put a false nose on her. Still, the peasants insist that she is a witch. What evidence do these peasants have that the woman is a witch? One peasant points to a wart. Another peasant claims that she turned him into a newt. She turned me into a newt. I got better, but I got better. But the wise Sir Bedivere understands that there are ways to determine whether or not the woman is a witch. Reasoning backwards, Sir Bedivere teaches the peasants that since witches must be burned, and since wood also burns, witches are made of wood. How do you know she is a witch? The next step, then, is to find out if the woman is made of wood. Instead of building a bridge out of her, because bridges can also be built out of stone, and instead of throwing her into the pond to see if she floats, the group decides, with the help of King Arthur, to weigh her on a scale with a duck. So that's one of my favorite scenes in the movie. Sir Bedivere is questioning the peasants, and he says, "What else floats on water?" And some of the peasants are wondering about that, and one of them says, "Very small rocks." And then King Arthur pipes in, "A duck." And then and then there's Sir Bedivere, recognizes King Arthur and says, "Who are you who are so wise in the ways of science?" So they bring out the scale. The accused witch admits it's a fair cop, or in other words, she admits that she is guilty of being a witch. So they drag her off to burn her. I've been thinking about this movie, about Monty Python and the Holy Grail a lot during the pandemic, and I know it's probably, what would you call it? Maybe it's a little sacrilegious. No, that's not the word I'm looking for. But I mean, other people have been talking about it. The whole "Bring Out Your Dead." There's a whole scene of the Black Plague, and that's another classic. The whole movie is great. I'm just saying, if you haven't seen it. But this scene in particular pertains to the comparison of witch hunts and how that relates to psychiatry. Even as we mock the absurdity of witch trials, Szasz's point is that there are modern-day witch trials taking place all around us. People are regularly being accused of being mentally ill. They are arraigned before psychiatric inquisitors, and when evidence for their supposed illness is requested, rabble-rousers and psychiatrists point to the modern-day equivalents of false noses, warts, newts, wood, ducks, and scales. Psychiatrists, the general public, and at times even mental patients themselves accept these conjectures as proof of mental illness. Szasz argues that, like the witches of yore, mental patients are labeled as social deviants in order to fulfill the societal need for scapegoats. Quote, "Majorities usually categorize persons or groups as deviant in order to set them apart as inferior beings and to justify their social control, oppression, persecution, or even complete destruction. In essence, society manufactures madness, and institutional psychiatry fulfills a basic human need to validate the self as good or normal by invalidating the other as evil or mentally ill." Szasz provides numerous accounts of scapegoating from the Greeks and the Hebrews to witch trials and beyond to demonstrate that the practice of scapegoating is nothing new and that it didn't end with the burning of witches. So this concept of manufacturing madness, which is in the title, the manufacture of madness, we've also talked about in a previous video with, it's going to be on my shelf here. It is, we talked about it before, and now I'm not seeing it. But you know the book I'm talking about. Here, let me look it up really quick. Sorry, I just have to remind you of this book because Crazy Like Us. It's showing how the manufacture of madness doesn't just happen in America, but there are ways that it's been manufactured worldwide, and how America has been transforming the way people think about so-called mental illness. Um, so back to this manufacture of madness. Szasz devotes particular attention to the father of American psychiatry, Benjamin Rush, who was an embodiment of an inquisitor. Szasz also exposes the absurdity of the theories of Freud and others who contended that insanity is caused by masturbation. He devotes another chapter to the model psychiatric scapegoat, namely the homosexual. Finally, he shows how the struggle for self-esteem produces the need for expulsion of evil in the form of scapegoats. So Benjamin Rush, we've talked about him a little bit before. I think there's even a passage here. Well, there's a lot of passages, so we'll get into some passages in this book, and maybe it'll mention why this founding father, why Szasz thinks of him as a sort of inquisitor. The Manufacture of Madness, a comparative study of the Inquisition and the mental health movement, is one of Szasz's most brilliant books. Although I disagree with much of his commentary, his underlying thesis, namely that institutional psychiatry is a reflection of the Inquisition, that medicine replaced theology, and that the persecution of mental patients replaced the persecution of heretics, is not only accurate, but perhaps even prophetic. This book is replete with keen insights and remarkably clear descriptions of the true nature of psychiatry. Here are a few noteworthy passages. And this is quoting Szasz directly, although I agree with Sigurist and other medical historians that psychiatry developed as the persecution of witches declined and disappeared, my explanation differs radically from theirs. They say it happened because the gradual realization that persons supposed to be heretics were actually mentally sick. I say it happened because of the transformation of a religious ideology into a scientific one. Medicine replaced theology, the alienist, the inquisitor, and the insane, the witch. The result was a substitution of a medical mass movement for a religious one, the persecution of mental patients, replacing the persecution of heretics. The mental patient, especially if so defined against his will, is perhaps best viewed as deviant, either of society as a whole or of a smaller group, typically the family. The individual who differs from his peers, who disturbs or scandalizes his family or society, is often branded as insane. Sometimes he need not even play a deviant role, but is declared mad nevertheless. We saw in a previous video I mentioned how even the Lord himself was accused of being mad. Another I mentioned in the Book of Mormon, there was a Benadiah, a prophet, who came among the people and told them the truth about their iniquities, and he was judged as being mad. Just some examples of scapegoating. Such psychiatric derogation fulfills important needs for the mentally healthy members of the group. The true believers in mental illness similarly maintain that human problems are caused by madmen and that incarcerating them in mental hospitals is good, whereas those opposed to this theory regard the explanation as false and the measures justified by it as evil. So I fall into the latter category of, like Szasz, believing that that it's false, that there's mental illness, and that it's evil to incarcerate people unjustly and involuntarily. Another passage. My thesis is quite different. Simply put, it is that there are and can be no abuses of institutional psychiatry because institutional psychiatry is itself an abuse. Similarly, there were and could be no abuses of the Inquisition because the Inquisition was the characteristic abuse of Christianity. So institutional psychiatry is the characteristic abuse of medicine. So here again, I think Szasz is being careful to distinguish that there is good medicine, that there is good religion, but there's also bad medicine and false religion and bad religion. For this reason, here's another passage. For this reason, I repudiate the tacit assumption inherent in designating mental patients as deviants, that because such persons differ or are alleged to differ from the majority, they are ipso facto sick, bad, stupid, or wrong, whereas the majority are healthy, good, wise, or right. The term social deviance for individuals incriminated as mentally ill is unsatisfactory for another reason. It does not make sufficiently explicit, as the terms scapegoat or victim do, that majorities usually categorize persons or groups as deviant in order to set them apart as inferior beings and to justify their social control, oppression, persecution, or even complete destruction. More about scapegoating. Okay, and now we'll get into witches. Significantly, the word witch comes from a Hebrew word that has been rendered benefica or venifica in Latin and witch in English. Its original meaning was poisoner, dabbler in magic spells, or fortune teller. The concept of witch combines occult powers with possibilities of benefaction or malefaction. This is an interesting point. Obviously, witches are connected with witchcraft, and Szasz sees psychiatry as following in that tradition. In connection with this, I was reminded of a passage in a book by Ann Blake-Tracy I mentioned earlier. Her book Prozac, Panacea, and Pandora. Excellent book. She has some interesting insights about how psychiatry attacks the spiritual or religious nature of human beings. And I just want to read some of what I've written on my blog about this, because Ann Blake-Tracy has found in that even this kind of problem was foreseen and foretold in the Bible. So in her book, she says, chapter 15, so this is in her book Prozac, Panacea, or Pandora by Ann Blake-Tracy. Chapter 15 addresses the religious aspects of increased serotonin, and we'll get right back to Thomas Szasz, but this pertains to the witchcraft. One particular gland in the brain is responsible for metabolizing 50% of serotonin. The gland is the pineal gland, known in Eastern religions as the third eye, and many other religions as the seat of the soul. It is believed that this gland is how we have access to the spiritual. If that gland is overloaded with serotonin, does that impair the pineal gland and shut off access to the spiritual? Is this why so many patients say they can no longer feel spiritual feelings? Is this why so many leave their religions, no matter which religion they are? Is that why so many report feeling possessed? So the pineal gland, Ann Blake-Tracy sees that being attacked specifically by psychotropic drugs, and that's one reason why psychotropic drugs are so dangerous, and why you hear a lot of people who are taking these psychotropic drugs that are euphemistically called antidepressants or antipsychotics or benzodiazepines, all these other drugs. They often say how terrible they feel. Some of them say, well, it saved my life, it made me feel better. And as we've discussed in a previous video, that's medication spellbinding. Peter Breggin has talked about that. But a lot of people just feel like they can't feel anything anymore. They just feel numb. So Tracy believes, and there's much evidence to support her claim, that the current drug nightmare was predicted many centuries ago in the Bible. Quote, John told us in Revelation 18, 23-24, that in the latter days, the merchants of Babylon would be the great men of the earth. Great generally meaning rich and powerful, and I know of none more rich and powerful than the pharmaceutical giants. This is Ann Blake-Tracy in her book. And that by their sorceries would all nations of the world be deceived, and that many would die as a result of this deception. Most look at sorcery as witchcraft, with little knowledge that the Greek translation of sorcery is pharmacopoeia or pharmakeia. Could John have made his warning or prediction any plainer for us? So, pharmakeia, the Greek word it's in Galatians, it's in Revelation, it's in these passages in the Bible. The definition is the English translation is the use or the administration of drugs, poisoning, sorcery, magical arts, often found in connection with idolatry, deceptions and seductions of idolatry. So here we have that, warnings, and there are many warnings in other scriptures of the witchcraft, and it's just interesting to note that the word from which witchcraft was derived is the Greek word pharmakeia, which obviously is connected to words like pharmacy, pharmacology, pharmaceutical. So just keep that in mind as we continue with Thomas Szasz on witches and the connection to psychiatry. As happens also in other professions, especially those pertaining to the regulation of social affairs, psychiatrists have been largely responsible for creating the problems they have ostensibly tried to solve. But then, like other men, psychiatrists cannot be expected to act systematically against their own economic and professional self-interests. I've noted in previous videos that Milton Friedman, maybe, I'm trying to remember the source, but someone was very astute in this observation that it is very hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. So I think that's true. So Szasz is giving, he's being lenient on psychiatrists because they sincerely believe in the myth of mental illness. They sincerely believe in a lot of them, the hoax, the chemical imbalance hoax. And a lot of, obviously, the vast majority of people still believe those hoaxes and those myths. So he's being very lenient toward them. It is sobering to contemplate the similarities among these inspirational messages. The good intentions and sincerity of the speakers need not be doubted. Pope, prince, president, each claims to be trying to help his suffering fellow man. What is chilling is that each ignores the possibility that the alleged sufferer, whether of witchcraft or of mental illness, might prefer to be let alone, that each refuses merely to offer his help and grant his beneficiary the right to accept it or reject it, and finally that each denies the painful truth that men upon whom the ministrations of the militant church and the therapeutic state are imposed by force rightly regard themselves not as beneficiaries and patients, but as victims and prisoners. And that's what I've said all along these videos, is that I just want to make sure that people have accurate information. That's why I've called it the truth about psychiatry, so that they can make their own decisions. In our day, the effect of obfuscating the differences between madness and dangerousness, psychiatric offense, mental illness, and law-breaking crime is the replacement of the Bill of Rights with the Bill of Treatments. The upshot in each case is therapeutic tyranny, clerical in the first instance, clinical in the second. The Inquisition thus combined the arbitrariness of the theological judgments with the punitiveness of the then prevalent penal sanctions. Institutional psychiatry similarly combines the arbitrariness of theological judgments with the punitiveness of now prevalent penal sanctions. Moreover, institutional psychiatrists now oppose attempts to undo the mystification inherent in the idea of mental illness and punish as enemies of the established therapeutic order those who persist in such efforts, just as formerly the inquisitors opposed attempts to undo the mystification inherent in the idea of witchcraft and persecuted those who persisted in such efforts. The intolerance is understandable. Doubt about the existence or dangerousness of mental patients would limit the methods permitted to institutional psychiatrists in combating mental illness, just as doubt about the existence of or dangerousness of witches would have limited the methods permitting to inquisitors in combating witchcraft. The Inquisition thus flourished so long as its agents were entrusted with special powers by the society they served. Institutional psychiatry now flourishes for the same reason. Only when these powers are curbed does such an institution wither away. The result is a pervasive conceptualization of social nonconformity as a contagious disease. That is, the mythology of mental illness, a widespread acceptance of the institution which ostensibly protects the people from this disease. That is, institutional psychiatry, and popular approval of the characteristic operations of this institution. That is, the systematic use of force and fraud disguised by the architecture of hospitals and clinics, the rhetoric of healing, and the prestige of the medical profession. Let's see if he gets more into the comparison with witches and witchcraft. He's again saying it. Physicians and psychologists, it's natural for them to act this way because their whole paradigm is resting on false information. Okay. Let's see. Okay. The inquisitors who opposed and persecuted the heretics acted in accordance with their sincere beliefs, just as the psychiatrists who oppose and persecute the insane, or the so-called insane, act in accordance with theirs. In each instance, we may disagree with the beliefs and repudiate the methods, but we cannot condemn the inquisitors doubly, first for having certain beliefs and then for acting upon them. Neither can we condemn the institutional psychiatrists doubly, first for holding that social nonconformity is mental illness, and then for incarcerating the mental patient in the hospital. Insofar as a psychiatrist truly believes in the myth of mental illness, he is compelled by the inner logic of this construct to treat with benevolent therapeutic intent those who suffer from this malady, even though his patients cannot help but experience the treatment as a form of persecution. And again, just reminded of the C.S. Lewis quote that I've shared numerous times in these videos. A tyranny, the worst tyranny is that of when it's exercised with the approval of one's own conscience. Institutional psychiatry is a continuation of the Inquisition. All that has really changed is the vocabulary and the social style. The vocabulary conforms to the intellectual expectations of our age. It is a pseudo-liberal social movement that parodies the ideals of freedom and rationality. Let's see. It is necessary to recall here the economic aspects of the witch hunts. The persecution of witches was exceedingly profitable for both the ecclesiastic and secular authorities and for the individuals engaged in this business as well. The property of the condemned person was confiscated and distributed among the witchmongers and their institutions. In addition, towns and cities would pay witch hunters for their work, the remuneration depending on the number of witches discovered. Just as the power and prestige of the witchmongers rose with the increased incidence of witchcraft, so has the power and wealth of psychiatrists with the increased incidence of mental illness. For a long time, it did not occur to people that the ecclesiastic epidemiologists of witchcraft had a vested interest in a high rather than a low incidence of this disorder. Indeed, as soon as this was fully appreciated, the witch mania was at an end. For an almost equally long time, it did not occur to people that the medical and psychiatric epidemiologists of mental illness have also a vested interest in a high rather than a low incidence of this disorder. Indeed, this idea must be socially repressed, and the psychiatric myth of mental illness is accepted as enlightened common sense. This is such a crucial point because you'll notice there is obviously a financial, there's an economic aspect of this the witch hunt for mental illness. And that's one reason why you always hear claims of the rise in anxiety, the rise in depression, the rise in mental illness. You know, 50% this and 90% this, and in your lifetime, you're just all these statistics that are being generated by NIM, the National Institute of Mental Health, or SAMHSA, or what's another one of these mental health propaganda uh, organizations. There's one that I'm thinking of specifically. The APA, American Psychiatric Association, um, and, NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They're always generating all this hype about how much mental illness there are. Well, obviously, who benefits from that? It's just like the witch hunters saying, your village is full of witches, and obviously, the more witches they find, the more they get paid. The exact same thing is true with psychiatry, and that's Robert Whitaker's book. Where is it? This one, Psychiatry Under the Influence, shows that just how much the financial incentive, how big the financial incentive is for psychiatry, and obviously for the pharmaceutical companies as well. So, more mental illness, more money for psychiatry. The same may be said for a present situation. No one knows for certain who is or is not mentally ill. Hence, the former need for witch finders, witch prickers, and inquisitors, and the present need for psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. Oh, this is a scathing, but I think it's so scathing because it's true. The prevalence of mental illness is a problem dear to the hearts of all modern mental health workers. Like the witchmongers of bygone days, contemporary psychiatrists never tire of emphasizing the prevalence of mental illness and the dangers to society of the mentally ill. As a result, our ability to see signs of madness all around us now approaches, indeed perhaps surpasses, that of all the medieval inquisitors' ability to see signs of heresy all around him. Symptoms of madness appear with increasing frequency in persons of all kinds, American and foreign, of high and of low station, living and dead. I think this also pertains to the current pandemic, the Wuhan virus, coronavirus, what's being called COVID-19. Obviously, there are people that are profiting from the fear-mongering of this, and there are people who are not. Millions of people losing their jobs. Anyway, that's another discussion. The identical dangers are inherent in the methods of institutional psychiatry. The pious inquisitor would undoubtedly have been enraged at the suggestion that he was the heretic's foe, not his friend. Likewise, the institutional psychiatrist angrily rejects the idea that he is the involuntary patient's adversary, not his therapist. In denying this interpretation, the inquisitor would have countered with the assertion that his ministrations, including burning the victim at the stake, were aimed at saving the heretic's soul from eternal damnation. Yeah, the witch hunters, they were burning people at the stake for their own good. While the psychiatrist replies that his efforts, including lifelong imprisonment, electric convulsions, and lobotomy, are aimed at protecting and promoting the patient's mental health. The comparisons are just so real, and I think Szasz is just really onto something in this book. Mental health workers now maintain, just as those assisting the Inquisition maintained formerly, that everything done to the victim is for his own good. Like the Inquisitor, the psychiatrist can sentence a person to mental illness, but cannot wipe out the stigma he has imposed. In psychiatry, moreover, there's no pope to grant absolute pardon from a publicly affirmed diagnosis of mental illness. This is a huge problem in psychiatry. Once a person is labeled as quote-unquote mentally ill, it is very difficult for that person, because there's no pope, there's no one to absolve him and remove the stigma and say, you're no longer mentally ill. Um, the key, I think, is for people to understand there's no mental illness in the first place. So whatever label was attached to that person was false, and attempt to uh, overcome its true identity, his or her true identity. When I think of true identity, again, I'm on this topic today. I just think of the verse in the Apostle Paul said, for God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. That's what God gave us. That's how He made us. And all of these other labels and other, identities, even race, religion, uh, like profession, all these other identities, those will vanish away and they don't matter. What matters is who you really are as in God's eyes as a child of God. That is my belief. Let's see. Let's see if there's any more. Okay. The physicians most responsible for classifying witches as mental patients were the celebrated French psychiatrists Pinel, Esquirol, and Charcot. They were the founders not only of the French school of psychiatry, but of all modern psychiatry as positivistic medical discipline. Their views dominated 19th century medicine. So I hope to get into a little bit of the history of psychiatry, or more into it with, getting, talking about these specific characters, Pinel, Esquirol, Charcot, Freud, Kraft-Ebing, Bleuler, Kraepelin, I think his name was John Cade, Cerletti, just a bunch of people that in the history of psychiatry that everyone should be aware of, just so they never fall into the trap of psychiatry. Just reiterating the myth of mental illness. Let's see. Criticizing the histories of psychiatry. Szasz is critical of the standard texts because they're all, as I mentioned before, they glorify institutional psychiatry rather than telling the truth about psychiatry. Much of what is now called insanity will be looked upon by future ages with a feeling similar to what we feel toward those who suffered as witches in Salem, Massachusetts. Ideologies couched in the salvational or therapeutic vocabulary are particularly resistant to criticism. Such belief systems command not only obedience to the truth, as revealed to priests or physicians, but also define skepticism as heresy or madness. The real significance of the therapeutic rhetoric thus lies in its power to disarm both victim and critic. For in a Christian society, who can be opposed to God? Only a heretic. And in a scientific society, or a pseudoscientific society, or the medical or the therapeutic state, who can be opposed to mental health? Only a madman. The lesson is that man must forever choose between liberty and such competing values as health, security, or welfare. And if he chooses liberty, he must be prepared to pay its price, not only in eternal vigilance against malevolent tyrants bent on enslaving their subjects. I think we've been seeing more and more of that today in these days. In eternal skepticism of benevolent priests and psychiatrists bent on curing souls and minds, but also in eternal opposition to enlightened majorities bent on reforming misguided minorities. Criticism of Benjamin Rush, again. Rush is generally thought of as a great liberal, that is, a lover of liberty. This is far from the truth. While he loved liberty, he loved power far more. And I'd have to do more study on Benjamin Rush. I admire all the founding fathers and everyone who contributed to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the founding But this particular uh, person, I do think Szasz may have had some insights into his character. It is clear that psychiatrists have a vested interest in diagnosing as mentally ill as many people as possible, just as inquisitors had in branding them as heretics. Yep. Case in point, a friend sent me a video the other day about people discussing Trump derangement syndrome. And while I think there's a real problem that a lot of people are very obsessed with Trump and they sometimes are so infuriated even just thinking of him, and I think it's sometimes funny to call it Trump derangement syndrome, which seems like a syndrome that some people have. I also think that any tendency to invent these syndromes is just one of the problems with psychiatry. Uh, it's not to say that people don't exhibit these so-called symptoms, but it's just that the whole labeling, the expansion of diagnostic categories or so-called diagnostic categories is just a way of expanding the influence of psychiatry for the economic or financial interest of psychiatry itself. Let's see if there's any more about this comparison of Szasz even mentions Edmund Burke, Alexis de Tocqueville, Ortega Gasset, and George Orwell. He's just a good reader. Modern physicians and psychiatrists are the perfect and infallible interpreters of science and nature, just as Renaissance popes had been of the Bible and of God. So Szasz is being hard on religion again, but I think he's being hard on psychiatry as perfect and infallible interpreters of science. It seems we have a lot of perfect and infallible interpreters of science these days, especially with the Wuhan virus. Let's see. Just more on witchcraft, witches, hunting down the mentally ill. The point of this discussion is to re-emphasize that institutional psychiatry is largely medical ceremony and magic. This explains why the labeling of persons as mentally healthy or diseased is so crucial a part of psychiatric practice. It constitutes the initial act of social validation and invalidation, pronounced by the high priests of modern and scientific religion, the psychiatrist. It justifies the expulsion of the sacrificial scapegoat, the mental patient, from the community. The scapegoat is necessary as a symbol of evil, which it is convenient to cast out of the social order, and which through its very being confirms the remaining members of the community as good. For the animal predator in the jungle, the rule of life is kill or be killed. For the human predator in society, the rule is stigmatize or be stigmatized. Because man's survival depends on his status in society, he must maintain himself as an acceptable member of the group. If he fails to do so, if he allows himself to be cast into the role of the scapegoat, he will be cast out of the social order or he will be killed. The psychiatrist creates mental patients as social objects so that he can act upon them in his own self-interest. That he conceals his self-interest as altruism need not detain us here, as it is but a fresh therapeutic justification for interpersonal coercion. So, okay, this is maybe the last passage I'll share from Thomas Szasz, The Manufacture of Madness. I have tried to show how mentally ill evildoers are recruited into our contemporary society. The massive manpower mobilization in the mental health movement is best understood as an attempt to increase the number of mental patients found in society, like mine owners hiring more laborers to tear more copper out of the bowels of the earth. The state and federal governments, their subdivisions, and private and philanthropic organizations are hiring more psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers to tear more madmen out of the bowels of society. And for whose good? The answer can only be for those who hire them, who define their task, and who, of course, pay them. This is why the transformation of the physician's role from that of healer of the sick individual to that of the civil servant or bureaucrat is so important. The implications of this process for psychiatry are especially momentous. So that's an interesting analogy. The only criticism of it I would have is that mine owners hiring people to mine copper or precious metals out of the earth, those workers are actually finding real things and mining them out of the earth. And things with, precious metals that are valuable and that are real things. Whereas I think, and as Szasz would agree, they're not really finding more madmen or mentally ill people. They're just labeling and stigmatizing people as such and mining them out of society as if they were, finding people that are actually had some sort of disease, which they don't. So that's how Szasz, a little bit about how Szasz compares the witch hunts, the Inquisition, to psychiatry, and we've seen even how in the Bible we've been warned that will be part of the sorceries, the deception of the last days that we'll have to be wary of. That'll eventually be abolished, and psychiatry will eventually be abolished. We've talked about the theology of medicine and how psychiatry fits into that theology, how it's a pseudo-religion or a false religion that masquerades as a science and as a medical profession. And we've talked about coercion as cure, how psychiatry is based on coercion, and how Thomas Szasz sought to abolish psychiatry and not simply to reform it. So that's today's video on the theology of medicine, from the coercion of cure, the theology of medicine, and the manufacture of madness. I hope you enjoyed the video, and feel free to like the video and subscribe to my channel. And if you have any questions or comments, please keep them civil and feel free to share those as well. And I will see you next time.